Awesome. Well, good to see all of you come before and those who have come here for the first time. We'll close that door eventually. But for those of you who are here for the first 2 weeks, you know that we started by talking about some pretty big topics. We started with week 1 with human dignity, which is the cornerstone of Catholic social teaching, the bedrock. And week 2, we focused on the universal destination of goods, which is a kind of technical concept, but it means that the goods of the earth are destined toward all. And I am just reminded, looking at Victor, that we need to start with a prayer. So would anyone like to give the prayer today? I'm bad at spontaneous prayers. All right. No, I'll go. Okay. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, give bread to those who are hungry, and to those who have bread, give a hunger for justice. Amen. In the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, we can actually start now. So for those of you who are here for week 1, we talked about human dignity, the bedrock concept of Catholic social teaching. And in week 2, we talked about the universal destination of goods, which is the distribution of wealth, the fact that the goods of the earth are meant for everybody. And if you notice, one of the common threads underlying both of those weeks, because we talked about the application of human dignity to immigration and the application of the universal destination of goods to the question of whether there should be billionaires or not. And so one of the through lines here, one of the kind of guiding threads is a concern for the poor, right? Like poverty is implicated in the questions that we've been discussing over the past 3 weeks. And one of the things I want to suggest is that Catholic social teaching views this focus on the poor not as incidental but as essential, that the focus on the poor is intrinsic, inherent to Catholic social teaching as a fundamental principle. And the Church articulates its commitment to the poor using a concept called the preferential option for the poor. And so that's what we're talking about this week, the preferential option for the poor. And this is actually a photo from downtown, from Hastings Street. I got it from Unsplash, but it's actually from here. And you see the old Army and Navy store that was turned into a homeless shelter. Hello, Daniel. And yeah, so like these are real world issues. And as we've been discussing over the past 2 weeks, Catholic social teaching, while it is very theoretical in many respects, there are more chairs over there if you want, right? Just okay. While it's very theoretical in many respects, it's also extremely kind of practical. It's lived. The entire purpose is to take the gospel and the principles of the gospel and articulate them in a way that's applicable to our contemporary realities. And so I want to begin today by reflecting on these questions of the poor, and I want to go back to the start. I think we'll go back to the beginning, to the Torah, and we'll look at a couple of passages from the book of Exodus, some passages that people tend to overlook. And the first passage I want to look at is this. Let's see if it's in focus there. Well, I think I made it worse. But so this is a passage from chapter 22 of the book of Exodus. And let's just take a look at what this passage says. Just let's take a look and let's see if you can notice anything about this, and we'll compare it to another passage. So Exodus 22, verses 1 to 5. When a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If the thief is seized while tunneling and he is beaten to death, there is no blood guilt in his case. If the sun is risen on him, there is blood guilt in that case. He must make restitution. If he lacks the means, he shall be sold for his theft. But if what he stole, whether an ox or ass or sheep, is found alive in his possession, he shall pay double. When a man lets his livestock loose to graze in another's land and so allows a field or a vineyard to be grazed bare, he must make restitution for the impairment of that field or vineyard. Interesting. This is probably one of the passages from the Old Testament, from the Torah, that I think we read and then we just move on from. We kind of skip, right? Because it's hard to understand. It's clearly applicable to ancient realities from a world that's gone. And I think that we have a tendency just to kind of read our Bibles, to read the book of Exodus, and just to move past this. But actually, many of the things that we consider to be boring details about the Old Testament actually contain a lot of theological content. Like genealogies, for instance. Genealogies actually have quite a lot of theological content packed in, but we all skip past them because, it's kind of boring to read. But this passage is interesting. It actually tells us something if we compare it to the passage that follows a couple of verses later. And that passage reads, "You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. If you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me, and my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword. And your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, do not act toward them as a creditor. Exact no interest from them. If you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you must return it to him before the sun sets. It is his only clothing, the sole covering for his skin. In what else shall he sleep? Therefore, if he cries out to me, I will pay heed, for I am compassionate." Same chapter, Exodus 22 of the book of Exodus. Same chapter, but what is the difference between these two passages, right? We have this passage here about what happens with, cases of theft, and we have this passage about ill treatment of widows or orphans. And I think what this demonstrates, if we read carefully, is that in this first passage, we're talking about ordinary, everyday matters. The language is very legalistic, right? It's very formulaic. If this happens, then this thing should happen. If you do this, then there's the penalty. If this, X leads to Y. It's very formulaic. It's very, prescriptive. It's just one thing leads to another. But in the second passage, there is something interesting that takes place, right? This is impersonal. One thing happens and there's a penalty. It's very juridical. It's very legalistic. But in the second passage, when we're talking about widows and orphans and the poor, God gets involved personally, right? If you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry. My anger shall blaze forth. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, if he cries out to me, I will pay heed. And so what this reveals, I think, and what a professor of mine in undergrad, whose name is Gary Anderson, a scholar of the Bible, said, is that God doesn't get involved with ordinary business, but has a personal relationship with those who have no one else. And this, I think, is at the heart of what the church calls the preferential option for the poor. God doesn't get involved with ordinary business. I mean, not saying he doesn't, but God, from these passages appears to take less of an interest in the ordinary course of events as in events that affect the poor, people who have no one else. And this is what's behind the concept of the preferential option for the poor, which is, I'll admit, a confusing term, the preferential option for the poor. And in part, it's confusing because the language that's used doesn't translate that well into English. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which we've been looking at in previous weeks, puts it this way. The principle of the universal destination of goods requires that the poor, the marginalized, and in all cases, those whose living conditions interfere with their proper growth should be the focus of particular concern. To this end, the preferential option for the poor should be reaffirmed in all its force. This is an option or a special form of primacy in the exercise of Christian charity to which the whole tradition of the church bears witness. So basically, what this is saying in so many words, is that what the preferential option for the poor means is that the poor are given preference, which kind of follows, right? That they get first dibs, or primacy, as the Compendium says, the language of the Compendium. When we consider how to allocate or spend our time or our resources, our first thought should be to the poor. And so you remember the passages from last week, right, where we talked about how, when a poor person steals the excess of a rich person, in the church's view, that's not theft. Actually, it's the act of hoarding on the part of people who have excess that qualifies as theft in the social tradition, and not the act of taking when you're desperate, right? So here the church says in the Compendium, right, which is a compilation, a summary of the church's social teaching, that the preferential option for the poor means that the poor get first dibs, which makes sense. And let's start to unpack kind of more of this term. The word option is interesting, right? The word option in the term preferential option for the poor, I think, can strike our Anglophone ears as meaning optional. Like, we hear the word option, we think we have an option to do something, we have an option not to do it. But in the church's wonderful Latin language, the word option doesn't actually mean optional. It means that we opt for something. We have to choose something. It's not actually optional, it's obligatory. On the contrary, what we do for the poor, we do for Jesus, and what we do for Jesus is not optional. So when the option for the poor means that we choose the poor in a certain respect. It means that we're opting for them, and that this opting is obligatory in the church's social tradition. And the word preferential, which I think we want to get into, preferential, is actually quite interesting as well. That's actually me. 11 years ago, with a figure called Gustavo Gutiérrez, who is a big thinker in Latin American liberation theology, who actually passed away, I think, last year or the year before. So, anyways, he kind of developed a lot of this idea around the preferential option for the poor before it was formally incorporated in the church's magisterial teaching, right? And last week we talked about how, we have all these theologians and these saints who have all these nice things to say about the poor and about wealth and about other social issues, but until their ideas gets incorporated into the formal magisterium, they're just private theologians. So he was functioning, of course, as a private theologian, writing in, I think, 1968, with a book called A Theology of Liberation. But the ideas that he, proposed in that book, in part, got incorporated into the formal magisterium of the church. Anyways, the word preferential here is super interesting. Preferential option for the poor. We keep on adding terms, right? Preferential option for the poor. Why do we have this word preferential? I had to dig up my notes from university for this. And according to Gustavo Gutiérrez, in a class that I took with him, he said that the word preferential in the phrase is something that exists in relation to the universality of the love of God. And I know that's kind of complicated, but it actually means, it refers to the fact that God's love is universal. Because according to, Father Gustavo and I think everyone else, the love of God is universal, right? The love of God is universal. It's for all people. It's a love without exclusion. But what the preferential option for the poor says is that the poor are first in line, so to speak, So it's a love that encompasses everybody, but the preferential part is that, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. That the poor come first in the church's eyes. That it's a poor church for the poor, to use Pope Francis's famous phrase. So, it recalls the fact, the word preferential here recalls the fact that God's love is for everyone. It's not just the option for the poor. God prefers the poor, but his love is extended to all. So that's the meaning of the word preferential. I know it's kind of confusing, but here's a pretty inelegant analogy. I prefer sushi, but that doesn't mean that I don't really like Chinese food. My culinary preferences are universal, unless you count Filipino food, in which case there is an exception. I'm sorry. But there is a preference for something, right? In theory, I like all foods, but there's a preference for something. And with the preferential option for the poor, the love of God is universal, extended toward all people, but especially and in a special way for those who have no one else, for those with nothing, the widow, the orphan, the poor among you. And we can add from the biblical tradition, the foreigner, right? They kind of go in pairs, right? Widow, orphan, foreigner. When the church or when the Bible wants to speak about people who are on the margins or excluded, it frequently uses that formula. Now, we've just talked about the word preferential, but confusingly, sometimes you'll just hear the phrase option for the poor without the word preferential attached. It actually means the same thing, but usually we add the word preferential here as a clarifier, but in the church's wonderful kind of Latin tradition, the clarifier actually makes the phrase more confusing, so you have to clarify the clarification, and that's just kind of the way it works. But preferential option for the poor, it refers to the fact, again, God's love is universal, but there's a preference for the most marginalized among us. So, thinking back to what we said about the book of Exodus, God gets involved personally where the weak and the marginalized are concerned. This is something personal for God. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. If you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me, and my anger shall blaze forth, he says. So the tradition attests to the fact, and the scriptural witness attests to the fact, that God has a special relationship with the poor, that he self-affiliates with the poor, self-identifies with the poor in a unique way. And I think we have to be pretty clear about this. This doesn't really say anything about the poor, right? The concept of the preferential option for the poor doesn't imply in the church's thinking that there's something special or, like remarkably moral or superior about the poor, but rather it implies that there's something special about God. And so, for instance, Gustavo Gutiérrez says this in a wonderful book called On Job, which is my favorite book by him if you want to take a look. On Job. God has a preferential love for the poor, not because they are necessarily better than others, morally or religiously, as we were saying, but simply because they are poor and living in a human situation that is contrary to God's will. The ultimate basis for the privileged position of the poor is not in the poor themselves, but in God, in the gratuitousness and universality of God's agapeic love, which is his self-giving, self-sacrificial love. Belief in God and God's gratuitous love leads to a preferential option for the poor and to solidarity with those who suffer wretched conditions, contempt, and depression, those whom the social order ignores and exploits. So that's interesting, right? I mean, I find it a beautiful quote. God has a preferential option for the poor, not because they're better than others, but simply because to be in poverty is contrary to God's will. The ultimate basis for the privileged position of the poor is not the poor, is not them in themselves. There's no intrinsic quality that makes any group of human beings better or worse than other people, but simply because God cares about people who are living in human conditions. That's the origin of the concept. So it says more about God than it says about the poor. It's a theocentric concept, right? And again, I want to stress the fact that even though I've been quoting from Gustavo Gutiérrez a lot, and in the previous weeks I quoted a lot from encyclicals, more from encyclicals. So this is, Gustavo Gutiérrez is obviously a private theologian, but I do want to stress the fact that, these ideas have been incorporated into formal magisterial teaching. They've been mentioned in plenty of encyclicals, and most recently in the new apostolic exhortation that was released, I think, 2 weeks ago. So that concept appears, and we'll talk about that in a second. Actually, we'll talk about it now. I've been reading this document. I actually haven't finished it. As I said, there's 120 sections. We're just like paragraphs, or 120 paragraphs, or maybe each section is 1 or 2 paragraphs. So, I'm at section 90, so I'm not fully there, but I did a Control F for places where the preferential option for the poor appears. Because I wanted to see what he has to say on this, And what I find really interesting in the document, the whole document is about poverty, right? It's a wonderful document where he kind of goes through the history of the church in respect of the poor, the way that the Christian community cared for the poor, the particular witness of the poor, and he has some really hard-hitting quotes and insights in the document. So if you have the chance to read it, I'd recommend. But what I found really interesting is how clearly Christological Pope Leo's understanding of the concept of the preferential option for the poor is. So, for instance, he says this in section 79 of the new apostolic exhortation, Dilexi, which was released, I think, which was signed on October 4th, the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, and released a couple days later, to the public, but officially promulgated on the 4th. He says this: the poorest are not only objects of our compassion, but teachers of the gospel. It is not a question of bringing God to them, but of encountering him among them. All of these examples teach us that serving the poor is not a gesture to be made from above, but an encounter between equals where Christ is revealed and adored. St. John Paul II reminded us that there was a special presence of Christ in the poor, and this requires the church to make a preferential option for them. Therefore, when the church bends down to care for the poor, she assumes her highest posture. So that's Pope Leo, document released like 2 weeks ago. And again, what I'm struck by is how Christological this is. And by Christological, I mean how centered this concept is around Christ. And obviously, every single concept of Catholic social teaching ultimately has a Christological foundation, right? What Catholic social teaching is an attempt to take the gospel and apply it and articulate it in ways that apply to contemporary reality. So ultimately, the basis of Catholic social teaching is Christological. It's rooted in the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels. But this is really explicitly Christological, right? The Pope calls the poor here teachers of the gospel, which is nothing new, of course. There's nothing new to say that we encounter God in the poor. But in Catholic social teaching, we have an explicit linking of the concept of the preferential option for the poor with this idea that when we meet the poor, we encounter Jesus, right? There's a special presence of Christ in the poor, and this requires the church to make a preferential option for them, right? It's the presence of Christ in the poor that inspires and that occasions the concept of the preferential option for the poor. I mean, in a sense, we could say that the church has a preferential option for the poor because the church has a preferential option for Jesus, and Jesus is in the poor. And if Christ is in the poor, if Jesus is in the poor, and Jesus is central to the church, which he should be in theory, then the poor have to be central to the church. When the church serves the poor, then she is assuming her highest posture, her highest dignity, which is to serve Christ. There's a Christological element here. When we serve the poor, it is service rendered unto Christ. And what's really interesting sacramentally is that early on in the history of the church, in the early Christian centuries, there was this sense that the Eucharist, which is the real presence of Christ in our theology, so the Eucharist and almsgiving were two sides of the same coin, that they were associated activities, correlated activities. And as biblical scholar Gary Anderson said, thank you. And as Gary Anderson, the biblical scholar, said, early in the development of the church, the giving of alms was linked to the celebration of the Eucharist. In the Eucharist, one represents the love Christ showed the world by the self-offering of his life. In almsgiving, the layperson has the opportunity to participate in this divine act by imitating that mercy in his or her daily actions. It is not accidental, this professor said, that the Eucharist and almsgiving were the two privileged means of channeling grace and dealing with the baneful effects of human sins. The two privileged means of channeling grace and dealing with the effects of sins. The Eucharist, this sacramental encounter with Jesus, and almsgiving, giving to the poor. Two sides of the same coin in early Christian thought. Because in a sense, in the Eucharist we encounter God in the flesh, but also, in a sense, in the flesh of the poor we encounter God. And this is a point that Pope Leo makes numerous times in this new document that was released a couple weeks ago. The idea of touching the flesh of the poor and encountering Christ comes up a few times in the apostolic exhortation, and this is one of those instances. The Christian tradition of visiting the sick, washing their wounds, and comforting the afflicted is not simply a philanthropic endeavor, but an ecclesial action, an action of the whole church, through which the members of the church touch the suffering flesh of Christ. Do you know what actually also is an ecclesial action, an action of the church? Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is Vatican II's constitution on the liturgy, constitution on the Mass, says that the liturgy is the action of the whole church. It's either that or in Lumen Gentium. But it says that the liturgy is the action of the whole church. So it's interesting here, we have this link, right? The action of the church is the liturgy, as we know from Vatican II, and the action of the church, an ecclesial action, is touching the suffering flesh of Christ by visiting the sick, washing their wounds, and comforting the afflicted. So the poor and the Eucharist, in the church's thinking from the beginning, are intrinsically related. And more directly, the Pope says, for Christians, the poor are not a sociological category, but the very flesh of Christ. Flesh, obviously, in these quotation marks, but the very flesh of Christ. I mean, there's a really concrete sense here where, even though the Eucharist is the real presence, when we touch the poor, we're touching God. And there's this parallelism between the Eucharist and the poor. The Eucharist is the flesh of God, and the poor are the flesh of God. So, preferential option for the poor, that's kind of like the basic kind of threads of the concept from the Church's social teaching. And we'll talk more after our discussion, but I wanted just to lay out kind of what the Church says in respect to the preferential option, why it matters, and then we'll go into our discussion. And the concept, or the questions that I had for this week are, does equality mean treating everyone the same? And secondly, who counts as poor? Which I think is an interesting question. But before we go into that, let's take, 10, 15 minutes. 10 minutes, it's 7:40. I think we have some chips, some cookies, some sparkling water, so maybe we can grab a bite to eat and then reconvene here for our discussion. So thank you. But thank you, everyone, for participating in that really, really good discussion. It was great to hear all of your insights. I mean, I really think that we have some really good conversations in this faith study. And I just wanted to wrap up with the question of who counts as poor, which we've obviously been discussing. The question is obviously really interesting, and I did once hear Gustavo Gutiérrez, when I was an undergrad, say that poverty is to be insignificant, and that to be poor is to not be seen as being human, right? To be insignificant and not to be seen as being human. So, and what we'll see from the magisterial teaching is that in theological terms, poverty is a bigger category, as we've been talking about, than just material or economic poverty. It is larger. It obviously encompasses and has a huge focus on material and economic poverty. But in the Church's thinking, it's much broader than that. It has to do with people who are vulnerable, exploited, and in some way on the margins. And I will quote from Pope Leo in Dilexi, because we talked about what counts as poor, like poverty, the face of poverty has changed over the years, where maybe, I think the terms that we use in kind of political science are we had more absolute poverty in former times, and now we have relative poverty in the so-called developed world. But in that document, Dilexi, the Apostolic Exhortation by Pope Leo, he says this, and I apologize for not putting it up, but it is a new document. I don't have the time to put everything up on the slides, but he does say this. In other times, for example, lack of access to electric energy was not considered a sign of poverty, nor was it a source of hardship. Poverty, Pope Leo says, must always be understood and gauged in the context of the actual opportunities available in each concrete historical period. Interesting. Looking beyond specific situations and contexts, however, a 1984 document of the European Community declared that the poor shall be taken to mean persons, families, and groups of persons whose resources, material, cultural, and social, are so limited as to exclude them from the minimum acceptable way of life in the member states in which they live. This is actually the very first time I've seen a document of the European Union or its forerunner, the European Community, cited in a papal document. Maybe it exists somewhere else, but it's interesting what he says here, right? Like in former times, not having access to electricity would not have counted as poverty. Like no one was poor because they lacked access to electricity in the 1500s. But now if you don't have electricity, you're excluded from some basic factor that enables you to participate in everyday, normal, social life in the context in which you live, right? And I think similarly, kind of the best example for us now is internet access, right? Where 20 years ago, maybe internet access was more of a luxury, and now it's essential for anything like getting a job or paying your bills or really doing anything, booking doctor appointments, right? So he says it's kind of relative to the actual opportunities available in each concrete historical period, and poverty is to be excluded so much that you can't participate in the basic way of life in the community in which you live. So that's Pope Leo quoting the European Community. In terms of kind of groups of people we see as poor, one of the most powerful passages from the tradition that talks about kind of various groups of people who count as poor comes from Pope Francis's really groundbreaking apostolic exhortation that he released in 2013 called Evangelii Gaudium, which was like a program for his pontificate. Amazing document if you ever get the chance to read it. But he says this in section, 210 to 211. He says this: "It is essential to draw near to new forms of poverty and vulnerability in which we are called to recognize the suffering Christ, even if this appears to bring us no tangible and immediate benefits. I think of the homeless, the addicted, refugees, indigenous peoples, the elderly who are increasingly isolated and abandoned, and many others. Migrants present a particular challenge for me, since I am the pastor of a church without frontiers, a church which considers herself mother to all. La madre de todos, as he said in his famous 2023 address in World Youth Day. How I wish that all of us would hear God's cry, where is your brother? Where is your brother or sister who is enslaved? Where is the brother and sister whom you are killing each day in clandestine warehouses, in rings of prostitution, in children used for begging, in exploiting undocumented labor? And he actually goes on to include several other groups in the list of people who are poor. And actually what's really interesting is he includes animals who are going extinct on the basis of human activity as among creatures who should be considered poor. So the... Yeah, exactly, right? So, he has this 2015 document, Laudato Si', which is an environmental, social encyclical. But as we can see here, the idea of who counts as poor is broad in the church's eyes, right? Refugees, the addicted, homeless people, indigenous people, the elderly, and obviously many other groups too. And so, thinking about all of these groups of people who we can consider poor in some respect, and I do think, actually, spiritual poverty does count, but it shouldn't absolve us of the need to think about material poverty. We can echo Pope Leo, who says this in this new apostolic exhortation. God has a special place in his heart for those who are discriminated against and oppressed, and he asks us, the church, to make a decisive and radical choice in favor of the weakest. The preferential option for the poor, the church's regard for the poor, encompasses all of these groups and more who are discriminated against and oppressed, who are on the margins in some way, excluded from normal participation in social, economic, political life. And that all of these groups are included in the definition of poverty when we think of the preferential option for the poor. And what Catholic social teaching and the gospel, demands of us is to make a radical and decisive choice in favor of the weakest. It asks us to make a radical and decisive option in favor of the weakest, if we would like to use that language. And I do just want to leave you tonight with a quote from John Paul II when he visited Toronto in 1984, who says this: "The needs of the poor must take priority over the desires of the rich, the rights of workers over the maximization of profits, the preservation of the environment over uncontrolled industrial expansion, production to meet social needs over production for military purposes." And so when we talk about the preferential option for the poor, we have to think about giving preference to the poor over, and that's what it means to give preference, right? Like, you give preference, by giving preference to a certain group, even though, again, God's love is universal, in a way, you're deprioritizing some of the priorities of groups of people who are not poor. And so when we talk about the preferential option for the poor, we have to think about giving preference to the poor over the desires of the rich, over the conveniences of the more well-off. And I think that, just reading the Gospels, I think we can see how this principle, especially of the preferential option for the poor, is, just a really beautiful, concise, and a bit confusingly worded way of taking the gospel and applying it to the realities of the world that we live in today. So that is week 3. Thank you all for coming tonight. Just a couple of announcements. We're not actually meeting next Tuesday. So as you know, this is a 4-week faith study. We did Human Dignity, week 1, Universal Destination of Goods, week 2, Preferential Option for the Poor, week 3. And in week 4, we're going to talk about a concept called integral human development, which I talked about. It's a concept that floats around Catholic non-governmental circles, academic circles, NGOs, charitable circles. And it's a topic that I like and that I studied for a bit in grad school, so we'll talk about it. Our next session is not next week. We're taking a break because I'm going to be in Montreal. But in 2 weeks, we will be resuming for our 4th and final session. And finally, if you would like to be added to the St. Peter's Young Adults WhatsApp group, which we use as a bulletin board to post event announcements, please just come see me or Victor. And that is all for week 3. I hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.